Well, good morning. How you guys doing? Good. Good morning to all of my friends here at the East Vancouver campus. And if you're at our Central or West or Battleground campuses, good morning to you as well. So glad that we get to continue this series that we started last week called Closer. And it's a series that we have been talking about based on the idea that we all have this varying levels of interest in getting closer with God. We all grow physically. I tell my kids this all the time. You're going to grow physically, but you're not inevitably going to grow spiritually. We need to respond to God in some ways so that we can grow spiritually as we continue to grow physically. As we grow biologically, we need to grow spiritually. And this series is all about how you and I can respond to God in ways that help His work take place in our life. And that is a very key distinction. In fact, last week, Matt Edmonds, our senior pastor, started us off on this series. And he started us off with an introductory message that I think is very, very important. And I just want to recap the point of that really briefly. It is not a series, and we're going to look at habits, practices, starting today and the next 4 weeks after this. It's not a set of practices where you pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's not the American dream version of spiritual growth, spiritual life. This is actually us responding, and that word responding is key, to what God has done already for us. You see, it's the grace of God that actually saves us, but it's His grace that is also actively changing us. And so the way I think of it is this: God has already done so much for me. What else am I going to do but give my very best back to Him? That is the response that all of us are invited into. And there are ways that we can respond through spiritual practices that will help us lean in to what God is already up to in our life. And so that is what we're looking at today. And we're going to look at 5 different practices, but all of them will have something in common. All of them will cost an amount of time. There is going to be a time component to all of these practices, which is why we're starting with the one that we're looking at today. And I think about when it comes to time and the use of time, I want to let you know something. I'm a little bit of a nerd about like productivity, okay? Now, you'll see, that doesn't mean I'm the most productive person in the world, okay? I got my own issues with that. But I do love productivity, like videos, productivity books, productivity pieces of software for my phone and my computer. And if you ever ask me about it, I hope you have a full 20 minutes free, because I will just start talking and I won't stop. Because I really am fascinated by things that make my life more efficient. And I came across this book recently that I wanted to buy. It's called Tyranny of the Urgent. Here actually is a picture of it on Amazon. It's called Tyranny of the Urgent. It's a great book, and it's about Jesus and how He used His time despite being very busy. I'm like, whoa, I want to read that book. So I ordered it. You ever order something on Amazon and you didn't really know what the final product is? It kind of comes and you don't expect what it is going to look like? That book is right here. I was slightly underwhelmed. I was expecting something else. Now, in fairness to Amazon, it does say pamphlet right there, and I missed it. But here's the real sad part. Okay, and this kind of shows you how actually productive I am. It took me at least a couple years of looking at this on my desk and on my nightstand before I'm like, I need to make time to read this, because my life is too ruled by the tyranny of the urgent to read the book, or whatever this is, called Tyranny of the Urgent. So I finally read it, and it was really helpful, and that shows, again, how productive or not productive I am, or successful at that. That challenge, and even just other challenges of going, man, is this really the way to try and cram more things into my life? Is that really the answer? And around that time, a bunch of people that I respect were reading a book by a guy named John Mark Comer called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Maybe you've heard of it. He used to be a pastor in the Portland area. And so I decided to go through this book because I'm like, maybe it's not about cramming more into my life. Maybe it's about making space, making margin in my life so that I have some breathing room. And I went through that book, and I got a confession. It's a great book, but I didn't connect with that book very well. And I think there's a couple key reasons why. I said I went through the book. I don't know what your views are on, if you listen to a book on audio, do you count that as reading the book? Do you say I read the book because you listened to it? I hear a lot of yeses. I don't know what you think at all the campuses, but I listened to the book. Why do you think I listened to it? Because I wanted to be able to multitask while I was reading or listening to the book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. There's another layer of irony, because who listens on 1 point speed? You could go 1.5, you can go 1.75, no way. This guy speaks very clearly, 2.0. I listened to it on double speed as I was multitasking. You wonder why I didn't love the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, because I was in too much of a hurry to stop and acknowledge what it meant for my life. So all that is just to show that I have a lot to learn. But one quote from that book really stuck out to me, and it's relevant to our topic today. The quote is this: "Why am I working so hard at becoming the person I don't want to be?" Ouch. I think sometimes my busyness and my pace of life can get in the way of my relationship with my kids because everything that they want to do is an inconvenience and an interruption. It can get in the way of my relationship with my wife, and it can get in the way of my relationship with God. And maybe you can relate with that. Maybe you and your own pace of life can get in the way of becoming actually the person you want to be. Enter today's spiritual practice. I want to talk about the item of solitude. The practice of solitude. Now, just to define our terms briefly, you may have this kind of off-the-cuff understanding of the word solitude. We understand solitude is alone time. Okay, but we're not talking just about alone time. Alone time would include Netflix or phone scrolling or a nap. That's all, those have their place, I'm sure. But that's not the kind of solitude we're talking about, because this is a spiritual practice. So we're talking about alone time with God. Solitude is the act of alone time with God, time where you and I can focus on who He is, who we are, listen to Him, talk to Him, respond to Him. It is that practice. It's that idea. And we're going to look at a piece of Jesus' story in Mark chapter 1. And what we will find is that Jesus is a very busy guy. And yet, He has a set of practices that model some solitude for us. I want to set the stage real briefly, and then we'll jump into verse 32. Jesus is just starting, actually go back a little bit, because we're not quite ready for this. Jesus is just starting His ministry in a town called Capernaum. And so you're in Mark chapter 1. You're at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right? You're at the beginning of this account, Mark's account of the gospel of Jesus. And he has just cast out a demon in the synagogue, the Jewish church setting. So that turned heads. And then he goes to his disciple Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is sick in bed with a fever, and he heals her. And Peter's mother-in-law is feeling so healthy, she gets up and hosts people on her feet the way she would have hosted if she was a perfectly healthy person. So all of this gets out into the town. And the town ends up flocking to Jesus because they realize there is somebody here unlike anyone we've ever seen or met before. And so in verse 32, we see the hubbub and the busyness of Jesus' life bubble up. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. So Jesus is in Capernaum. The sun has gone down because it says after sunset. Now, there is a part of this that makes a lot of sense and a part of this that is very unique and alarming. First of all, they come to Jesus after sunset because that day happened to have been the Sabbath. And so you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. And if you know Old Testament law at all, you know that there's lots and lots of rules about how far you were allowed to walk and how much weight you were allowed to carry. So in that sense, it makes sense that after sunset, people came and brought the sick to Peter's house because they weren't allowed to work. Sun goes down, it's the end of the day, now they're allowed to work, the Sabbath is over. But it's remarkable because when the sun went down at this time of history, in this era, an area of the world, the day was over. The day was done. There aren't street lights and light switches, right? So when the sun goes down, you hunker down. The day is done, the work is done, and you're just like getting ready to go to bed. And yet, after sunset, that's when all of this activity bubbles up because the people have such an urgency to get to Jesus. It's dark, the sun is down, the day is over, it doesn't matter. We're getting to this place where we know this man is. And so they come in droves. Look at the next couple verses. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Jesus is exerting his spiritual power, his divine authority over physical and spiritual oppression, and it says that the whole town gathered at the door. This word, the whole town, it's like the word for like a steady flow. Just people kept coming by. It's almost Halloween, and maybe you live in a trick-or-treat hotspot neighborhood. And you hear the first doorbell ring, and you go, you give the kids some candy, and you go back and you sit down. And then the doorbell rings again, and you get up, and you're just not even having time to like sit down for more than 10 seconds at a time because they just keep coming in a steady flow. So you're like, time out. I'm just going to sit on the porch, okay? Because it is not even worth closing the door and going back into my living room because there's so many kids coming to your house. Maybe that's the kind of neighborhood you live in. That's exactly what's happening here, is that people just keep coming because they know that there's someone here who has power that they have not ever experienced before. You know, it's amazing that Jesus becoming a human being has so many implications for you and I to just marvel at. And one of those is that Jesus knows what it's like to be busy. Jesus knows what the frantic pace of life is. Jesus knows what it's like to have more to do in a day than can mathematically fit in the number of minutes you have to spare. He knows that feeling. And so the reality for Jesus is the same reality for us, and that's this: there's always more you could do than you actually can do. That's the first set of blanks in your notes after the definition of solitude. There's always more you could do than you actually can do. And when we acknowledge this reality, we change the conversation from, can I get it all done? Because, hate to break it to you, the answer is no, you can't get it all done. And we start saying, what is most important for me to get done? It changes the conversation from a quantity conversation to a priority conversation. What do I need to prioritize that is most important for me in this busy season of life? Because there's more than I can ever get done that I could do, but I need to prioritize wisely. And we see what Jesus prioritizes in verse 35. After this busy night, we see this. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Jesus made time for solitude. Very early in the morning, he went off to experience some solitude, some alone time with God. Now, this is a really beautiful example of Jesus getting this alone time with God, and one of the reasons is in some verses we haven't gotten to yet, and I'm excited to get there. But there are lots of examples of Jesus in the Gospels getting away and getting some alone time with God. In fact, Luke 5:16 sums it up for us almost best. It says this: Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. This was a pattern for him. And he prioritized solitude in the sense that he didn't wait for time to open up. He took his day and he went and he made time. He acted upon his day in a proactive way, and he made time to get alone time with God. And we see that in the 4 verbs, actually, in this verse. The last verse we just looked at. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus, he got up, he left the house, he went off to a solitary place, and he prayed. He got up. That's probably the hardest one of the 4, is my guess. I don't know how late Jesus was up the night before. I don't know if they shut it down and said, okay, last call, last three healings, and then we got to shut this down. Jesus has to go to sleep. Or if maybe the trickle just died down. I have no idea, but it probably was a late night. And it was all dependent on Jesus. Like, Jesus couldn't tap out. Jesus couldn't say, okay, Peter, you take this one. Jesus was the focal point of this whole night, and it was just going and going. And yet, he gets up. And I think that's not to be overlooked. That probably was a hard thing. He probably had to splash himself with water or whatever. I don't know. But after he got up, he leaves the house, because you can imagine homes in this time frame were not like big on square footage. And Jesus had a lot of disciples. I picture Jesus like stepping over the disciples' sleeping bodies as he's trying to get out of the house, because there's nowhere to be alone within Peter's house. And then in fact, he's so committed to getting alone that he actually leaves town. He went off to a solitary place, which was probably outside the town in the wilderness. You know, this is not too far from the equator. It's warm enough to be outside, and there's not a lot of, urban sprawl. And so you could go into the wilderness, the bush, and you could have some alone time in the forest, in the fields, in nature. And then finally it says he prayed. You can go back one. He prayed, which is not just a check mark activity. The verb tense is actually that it was an ongoing activity. You can almost say where he was praying. He didn't just say, okay, pray, check, next thing. He was in a constant state or process of prayer. It's the ongoing activity, the ongoing action of praying. And there he was having alone time with God. And we see that he's busy, and yet the principle from this verse is this. The next set of blanks: being busy makes solitude more challenging. That is true, but no less necessary. Jesus was very busy, but he made space for solitude. Being busy makes solitude more challenging, but no less necessary. And so, as Jesus is having this moment with the Father, I picture him having a really sweet time of prayer, and he's just getting recentered, and he's feeling his heart just filling up. What's more real life than having a sweet moment get crashed in on by the busyness of the world you're trying to escape? That just sounds like my life, to be honest. And this is exactly what happens to Jesus, because the disciples find him. They go looking for him, and they find him. Simon and his companions went to look for him. And when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone's looking for you." There's a sense of urgency. Everyone is looking for you. I don't know if people were like banging on the door and the disciples were like, What? Jesus? Who is that? And then it's like the townspeople asking for more miracles to start up again because that earlier night was so exciting. Or maybe it was the disciples who woke up first and were like, "This ministry is taken off like a rocket. We are excited. You thought yesterday was big. Today is going to be even bigger." We got the platform plans ready for his afternoon presentation. We've got the social media campaign all strategized. We're getting t-shirts printed. They'll be here by the end of the week. This Capernaum launch site for Jesus' ministry is going better than we even expected. So go get Jesus. They're like, "Where is he?" "I don't know. He's not where he was last night." "We got to go find him." Meanwhile, Jesus is just praying in the woods, and suddenly out from behind a rock, Peter's like, "There you are, Jesus!" And he's just like, "Oh man, you found me." And they're like, "We've got to get back to Capernaum." Why? Because there's this urgency in the disciples' minds, and I think it's pure motives. I think they had a good heart about it. They were like, "We got to ride this wave. It's happening, and it's happening now. Strike while the iron's hot." And Jesus responds in a kind of an interesting way. Why? Because what is urgent is not always what is important. Isn't that true? What is urgent and pressing and demanding and in our face is not always what's the most important thing. For example, you might feel the urgency of getting to your destination on time. And you got to leave the house and you got to get to the car, but your daughter, who you told to get her shoes 10 minutes ago, can't find her shoes because she never actually went looking for them. And now it's time to leave the house and she can't find her shoes and you're going to be late. And the temptation, I just made that example up off the top of my head, by the way. The temptation is to prioritize the urgent internal compulsion to be on time, to not be late, over my responsibility and opportunity to shepherd the heart of my child. One is urgent, the other is important. And I can often put what's urgent in front of what's important. You have a work deadline, it's a project or a paper in class or something that has this final deadline, and you are under the gun and it might not happen. But what if you were able to cut some corners? What if you were able to shave off a few angles, take a shortcut? It's kind of not fair, it's kind of cheating, but the urgency of getting that project turned in on time can sometimes overcome what's really important, which is your character, your reputation, your integrity. And we can sacrifice the important thing when the pressing, urgent thing is banging on our door. And the reality is, the fact is, what is urgent is not always what is important. And so we can see Jesus' willingness to prioritize what's important over the urgent in how he replies to the disciples. The beauty of what Jesus experiences in his time of solitude is shown to the disciples and to you and I as we read the Gospel of Matthew in verse 38. Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." And the disciples go, "You guys, I thought he just said we're supposed to leave." "Jesus, I didn't hear you correctly. You didn't say we're supposed to leave, did you?" He's like, "No, let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages. That is why I have come." Jesus shows us some of the clarity and the recentering of what his alone time with God allowed him to know. And the first one is this. When he says, "Let's go somewhere else," he's actually acknowledging the fact that it's not about me. Yes, I could go back to the parade. That platform you're talking about, that sounds kind of cool. Social media campaign, okay, that just makes my skin crawl. I don't like that. But I see what you're doing, disciples. This could be a big, booming ministry opportunity for us. And I could be at the front of this big parade in Capernaum by sundown. But that's not what I'm here for. Jesus understood after spending time with God that his life was as much about his death and sacrifice as it was about his life. His ministry was more about scattering the seed than it was about reaping the harvest. The harvest will come. You and I, at all our campuses, we're part of the harvest. Jesus' role while he was on earth was to give of himself and to sacrifice himself and to scatter seed, not necessarily to enjoy reaping the harvest. He was there to put the foundation in place. He didn't get to and knew that he wasn't destined to, in the will of the Father, to obey or to benefit from the structure over his head. He was there to make the foundation. And so he knew it was not about him. But not only that, but he goes to the next part. Let's go somewhere else to the nearby villages so that I can preach there also. His heart gets turned away from the self-interest of popularity and goes outward to the people God has called him to serve. Why? Because it is about others. God has called me to go to different places to serve and to teach and to give of myself. And by the way, to start over. I could build on what I started in Capernaum, but I actually need to start over, hit reset on that, go somewhere else to where people don't know me. I'll be a stranger again. I'll have to rebuild my own kind of sense of who I am, and they'll have to meet me and figure me out. I'm going to start from scratch other places because God has called me to serve more people. It's not about me. It is about other people. And then it kind of gets crystallized in this really, really powerful statement by Jesus. After spending alone time with God, he looks at his disciples and he says this simple phrase, "That is why I have come." Jesus has a renewed, centered focus on his purpose for being sent to this earth. His purpose, that is a combination of the direction he is called to go and the motivation to go there. Purpose is like a combination of direction and motivation. And Jesus says, this is my purpose. I know why I have come to earth. Jesus is not like us. We forget. He didn't forget. And yet there is a benefit, it seems, to having spent time with God in his humanity. Alone time with the Father has recentered him on saying, it's not about me, it is about these other people, and I have a renewed sense of my direction and my motivation. We need to go. And so inevitably, Jesus lives out, performs the acts of his ministry in verse 39. It's almost inevitable that it goes to this after his renewed sense of purpose. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. There he goes. His tank is full. His sense of vision for the ministry God has called him to is sharp. And he goes and he does the will of the Father. So, what does that mean for us? It means that there is a paradoxical reality to spiritual growth for you and I. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. And that is a full and busy life is not necessarily all it's cracked up to be, because when it comes to growing spiritually, being still is actually the key to growing closer. Being still is actually the key to growing closer to the Father. And if we are to make the most of God's gracious work in our life, we would do well to at times stop doing what I tend to do, which is just run, go, fill. And we need to make space in our schedule the way Jesus did to say, nope, I'm going to spend some alone time with the Father. And the same benefit that Jesus experienced is the benefit that we get to experience. And I rephrased them in our notes if you want to fill out the blanks. Solitude offers us a few things. Solitude offers us a freedom from the trap of self. When I get busy, I get selfish. I'm just going to say it. When I get busy, I tend to do the things that make me feel good and make me feel happy. My sense of whether I'm successful or failing comes from what other people say about me or think about me. And so it becomes all this self-feeding kind of lifestyle. And I said it's a trap because it is a trap. My selfish mentality is like a prison. It's like a hunger that is not satisfied with more self. And when I spend alone time with God, and when you and I make space in our life for solitude, we can be refreshed by the reminder that it's not about me. It's not about me. You know what? The world doesn't revolve around me. You know how much of a relief that is? It's way too much pressure. If the world revolved around me, it would just crush me. Thank the Lord the world doesn't revolve around me. It revolves around him. And my role is not to go, God, what can you do for me? My role is to say, God, it's not about me, it's about you. Lord, what can I do for you? And that comes from a refreshed sense of spending alone time with God. And the second thing then is the outflow of that, which we saw in Jesus' phrase, which is the power to care for others. Hey, we're going to leave this place because it's not about me. We're going to go to these other places to continue to preach and teach because it is about those people. And God has called us to care for people in our life. And can I just say, caring is hard. I found it helpful to just normalize the phrase compassion fatigue. You ever have compassion fatigue? If you're in the education sector, and a lot of my friends are, those students are needy. And you know what? After the school year ends, you get 3 months of summer, and then a whole new batch of needy students come your way. And it is not ever stopping. You ever in the medical field? I got lots of friends in the medical field. Man, you want to talk about compassion fatigue. And then, you just talk about parenting. It's like, these kids, they never stop asking me for things. Would you please just leave me alone? Compassion fatigue, it's hard to care. And when we spend alone time with God and we go, okay, it's not about me, God then has this way of refueling and refilling our tank to go, it's about these people. It's about the people he's called me to serve. And there's this renewed tank-filling sense of going, I feel my cold heart warming. I feel my sense of empathy growing, and I can move forward with direction and purpose because I'm reminded that it's about the people he's called me to serve, which again then is the last one. I alluded to it just now, which is that it's the clarity to live with purpose. Alone time with God can recenter you on why God made you. And do you know he made you for a reason? He made you for a purpose. You have a divine, eternity-impacting purpose that God created you for. And when you spend alone time with God, why is it shocking at all to go, that is going to help me recenter and remember why I exist? And it will get me back onto a sense of direction of the way I'm supposed to go, the way I should be living, the things I should be doing, but also it'll come with a sense of motivation. Because that's what purpose is. It's direction and motivation to go, I know where I need to get to, and I have a renewed vision for why it matters that I get there. I have a sense of joyful motivation to walk the path that God has called me to walk. See, when we see solitude in these ways, which, by the way, is nothing other than just uncovering the lid and going, what's it like? It's just right there for us to see. It's clear. The beauty and the benefit of spending alone time with God, when we acknowledge the reality of this, we see it's not an obligation, as in some kind of Christian duty. It's an invitation. It's an invitation. The God of the universe invites you to make space in your day for him. Come on. That's ridiculous. And yet it's exactly what God says. It's exactly what Jesus modeled for you and me. And we are invited, not obligated, invited to spend alone time, solitude with him. So we're going to talk about some specific ways we can do that. But before I do, I just want to give an honorable mention to a side topic that has to do with that rectangle that's probably in your pocket or your purse right now. It would be amiss to probably not acknowledge cell phones at all. Because it's true. It might be true for you that your biggest barrier to solitude might not be busyness, although I think being busy is pretty common. Your biggest barrier might be a sense of focus, a sense of ongoing need to have noise, either literal noise or figurative noise. And your attention could be so used to this with all your free time that you may miss the opportunity to spend alone time with God because of the phone nearby. And it is a growing conversation, even outside of the church, to talk about this phrase. We need to learn to, have you heard this? Parent our phones. We need to keep our phones where they belong, keep them out of where they don't belong. We need to make sure they don't take over our lives because the dopamine joy of going, ooh, that's new, ooh, that's fun, ooh, that's cool, can threaten to just creep into all of the open places and spaces of our day. and it can threaten our opportunity to have alone time, solitude with God. Okay, so how can you and I, in our busy lives, how can we make space for God? And sure, there's some big things you can do. You can go away for a day or a night at a time, and for what it's worth, I have friends at this East Campus who have made that happen. One of them is a mom who homeschools her kids, and one of them is a single mom who made plans for her 3 kids, and she got out of town too. So it's possible to spend some alone time with God. Not too long ago, Matt Edmonds, our senior pastor, talked about a day away to pray. Maybe you make plans this next year to get a day to spend some alone time with God. There's other medium versions of that too, in an afternoon or something, and I think the mentality there is to say, if I get some open space or some free hours, let me not just assume that I'll rush to fill it with something else, because maybe there's an opportunity for me to spend some alone time with God. Those are all really, really good. But I want to focus our conversation on the really small rhythms and routines that you and I can build into our regular days and our regular weeks to build a pattern of smaller incremental forms of alone time with God. And so the action item that I'd like to encourage you, and I'll explain what this means in a second, is to decide and confide. Again, we're talking about small incremental ways of spending alone time with God. I want you to decide and confide. What does that mean? Decide on the when and the where. Decide on when you're going to spend alone time with God and where you're going to make it happen. This is really key in creating a plan that you'll follow through on, a way to visualize what you're going to do. Not just to say, I should do that, but make a plan. And the most basic version of this plan is the when and the where. Decide on when you're going to do it and where. And then just a note on when. There is nothing overtly spiritual about doing it early in the morning, okay? God is the Lord of all hours of the day and night. But I will say, it's probably for you going to be in the morning. Only because that is pretty normal. It's that way for me. Once my kids wake up at a certain time in the morning, my time is no longer my own. So my solitude on a regular basis, other than being opportunistic, my regular solitude needs to be before my kids wake up. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And that's probably true for most of the people in this room. Not everyone. And again, it's not more spiritual to do it that way, but it's probably going to be in the morning. So your conversation is probably going to look like, when do I need to set my alarm? And how serious do I need to be disciplined to respect that alarm? And not snooze, 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 snooze until I get up at my regular time. That's just a side note on when it might happen. Decide on the when and the where, and then confide. You might actually know what I'm getting at here. Tell someone, tell a friend, tell someone in your life. This will be in our community group discussion guide. And so if you're in a community group, you don't even need to pick a person to share it with. You just go to community group, and you'll be sharing it with someone. But if you're not in a community group, certainly find someone to tell. Because when you tell someone, then it reinforces the behavior. It is so valuable for you and I to create, not to wait for hopefully opportunities that open up on their own, but to take our schedule the way Jesus did and peel apart 2 busy things so that we can fit it in and say, I'm going to spend some alone time with you. It's just so real life to acknowledge Jesus woke up really early to make it happen, and even so, busyness crowded in on him before he was necessarily even done. That's just real life, and yet he made it happen, and it was worthwhile. And the reality is, the point of all of this is that being still, in an opposite sense, is actually the key to moving closer. If you want to get closer to the Lord, make some time to stand still. Stop running so hard. Acknowledge that you're invited into his presence, and be still so that you can hear from him, talk to him, spend some time with him. And we're going to talk about ways in the next several weeks of how you can fill that time. And there's some other practices that would go right along with this practice of solitude. But we do need help. We need God's help for this. And I just want to respond to him in prayer as we conclude. So let me pray for us. Lord, I am genuinely comforted by being reminded that you know what it's like to be busy. And Lord, I do not presume to be the busiest person at this campus or any of our campuses. But Lord, you get it. You can empathize, not just in theory, but in actual practice. You remember, you know what it's like to have more to do in a day than you could ever actually accomplish. And in that sense of comfort, Lord, I want to ask that you would help us model for others what you have modeled for us. That you would help us respond to your example, and that we would stop running so hard, and that we would make space in our life to just be in your presence. God, it's in those times that we get to experience your goodness, that we get to remember your promises, that we get to recenter and refocus on what really matters. Not just what's urgent, but Lord, what is really important. God, we need that. We need that in our life because life is way too important to just waste away running around thinking we can do it all. Forgive us, Lord, for trying to be so self-sufficient that we forget to stop and be with you. Help us to have a healthy sense of dependence on you. Help us to be motivated, drawn in by your appealing, warm invitation to spend that time with you. And God, when we make that time happen, meet us there. Refocus us. Fill us up so that we can serve you better. We thank you, Lord. It's all by your grace and by your power in our life. We pray this in your name. Amen.